Teachers tried to humiliate Black Boy with violin. Then his music brought the room to tears. The words had already begun echoing through the halls of Eastwood Conservatory before Devon Carter even touched his strings. At 12 years old, he was the only black student in a sea of polished shoes, bright uniforms, and family names etched on gold plaques around the school's marble walls. His shirt was borrowed, too large across his shoulders, and his shoes were secondhand. In his hand, he carried his father's battered violin case, patched with tape and prayers. The other students smirked. One of them whispered just loud enough for the sound to carry, "Classical music isn't for kids like him." Professor Malcolm Whitmore, tall, silver-haired, wearing a blazer that cost more than Devon's monthly rent, seized a moment. He had been waiting for it, perhaps savoring it. Whitmore believed he was a curator of musical excellence, the guardian of standards. He looked down at Devon from behind a mahogany podium that gleamed under chandeliers and said, "Young man, people come to Eastwood seeking refinement, culture, class. Wouldn't rap or hip-hop suit you better than Bach?" The room laughed. A dozen polished violins leaned beside their chairs like ornaments, their owners smirking easily. Mothers and fathers in the audience stiffened in amusement. The professor's words landed like ice. Devon gripped his father's cracked violin case tighter. He did not move. He did not smile. He only lowered his gaze for a heartbeat, and then something in his eyes shifted, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this exact moment. 3 hours earlier, somewhere far from marble pillars and chandeliers, an alarm clock scraped the silence of a two-bedroom apartment in Detroit's East Side. Devon's bare feet touched cracked linoleum. The radiator hissed like an angry animal. The walls were blotched with water stains. His mother, Claudia Carter, had only returned a moment ago from another overnight shift washing floors at a hospital, her body carrying the scent of bleach and exhaustion. Yet even in that tired body lived a steel unbroken by hardship. She paused in the bathroom doorway, watching her son already on his feet, already placing his chin on smooth, with that carried more history than wealth. The violin had been his father's, played through joy and weddings and nights when hope was fragile. His father, Marcus Carter, had been a construction worker who loved Bach. He was gone now. Heart stopped at 39, but the violin remained. Devon placed bow to string. In the narrow space between kitchen and couch, where others might place a dining table, music filled the cold, peeling apartment. The tone wasn't perfect. He had never had a teacher. His fingers were sometimes unsure. But in those notes, there lived hunger, urgency, defiance. Bach's Partita in D minor, the same piece that in less than 4 hours would decide his future. The first movement floated out into the broken hallways. A baby cried upstairs. Neighbors walked to work. But in Devon's music, another world opened. His mother whispered, "You'll wake the whole building again, baby." But she smiled a faint, tired smile because when she heard him play, she remembered her husband's words. Music doesn't come from an instrument. It comes from the heart. And Devon had inherited all of that fire. Back in Eastwood Conservatory's polished audition hall, everyone expected disaster. The board sat in velvet seats, whispering about donors and family names. Other children had entered the room before him, wearing bespoke clothes with private tutors at their elbows. They carried violins worth more than Claudia's annual salary. He carried one so worn its varnish had dulled to honey, with a crack sealed by prayers. Already they had decided. Already. He was a charity case, the entertainment before real candidates performed. Whitmore spoke again, his voice hard as marble. "Have you ever performed in a setting like this before? Perhaps we should find you something more suitable." Around him, laughter rippled. It had the rhythm of cruelty dressed as sophistication. Devon raised the violin unshaken and said only, "I'd like to play Bach." The first sound was a single note, drawn so true and so fragile it pierced the hush. That note was not the awkward scraping of a beginner. It was clean, resonant, and trembling with soul. Silence rushed in, sharp and sudden. A cough died in someone's throat. Devon continued. It was imperfect. His technique left room for trained eyes to criticize. But what he gave the room was more than precision. It was truth. His bow tore sound from the instrument as though every sacrifice his mother made, Every insult he had swallowed, and every dream of his late father were condensed into vibrations. His fingers moved faster, guided not by expensive lessons, but by years of nighttime practice learned from hours on YouTube videos and borrowed books. The giggles faded, replaced by an unease that spread like wildfire. Professor Whitmore's smirk faltered. He leaned forward with a frown, unwilling to believe what he was hearing. This child, self-taught from the east side of Detroit, was moving through Bach's labyrinth with a furious grace. Every note seemed alive. And then came the saraband. Its slow lament filled the room with unbearable tenderness. Each drawn-out note dragged pain and longing and love into the open air. A board member lowered her notepad without realizing she had stopped writing. A student pinched his pristine uniform sleeve, suddenly nervous that in this room he was no longer the best. Claudia Carter, sitting at the back, in her wrinkled hospital scrubs because she couldn't afford new clothes yet refused to miss this moment, pressed a trembling hand over her lips, tears catching in the corners of her tired eyes. She knew. Devon finished with the giga, the swift dance spiraling across the strings like fire dancing along dry timber. The tempo rose, his fingers blurred. The room holding breath as a child who had learned every scale alone turned technique into triumph. He struck the final chord. Silence followed. Silence thicker than marble pillars. For a long heartbeat, no one moved, not even the professor. Then Helen Morrison, concertmaster of the Detroit Symphony, seated quietly in the back as a guest, rose to her feet. She began to clap. The sound spread, first hesitant, then fierce, until 30 people stood clapping as though trying to atone for what they had believed. Tears marked cheeks. Students clapped hardest of all, humbled. The applause built into thunder. Devon lowered his bow, bowed gently, and whispered with dignity, "Thank you for hearing me." Later, as the applause still echoed, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the Academy's founder, approached, her eyes glistening as she held out an envelope. "Mr. Carter, welcome to Eastwood. Full scholarship, private lessons, Vienna in the summers. And one more thing. We will establish the Marcus Carter Memorial Scholarship in your father's honor. Others will follow in your path." Whitmore stood behind, gray-faced drain of authority. Slowly, awkwardly, he extended a hand. "I was wrong." Devon looked him in the eye, young but already carrying the weight of centuries of bias pressed onto his shoulders, and said, "Music belongs to everyone. Maybe now you'll remember that." He shook the professor's hand, firm, steady. Months later, Devon stood at Orchestra Hall, playing that same violin beside musicians with instruments worth 6 figures. He didn't care. The sound was his. His mother sat in the front row in her first new dress in years, watching with tears of relief that tasted like victory. Whitmore, too, sat there, no longer smirking, but taking notes, learning from a boy who had once been his target. Devon soared, his father's crackline violin pouring music beyond money, beyond class, beyond prejudice. Journalists wrote afterward that when Devon played, you no longer saw a poor boy or even a rising star. You saw proof. Proof that greatness lives in unlikely places. Proof that brilliance doesn't ask for permission and doesn't care for marble walls. Proof that humility does not equal weakness. His story spread. Social media poured with clips of the performance. The boy who silenced a professor. The violinist they tried to humiliate. Hashtags rose. Talent has no address. Music is for everyone. In time, he played Carnegie Hall, and the crack on his father's violin was visible under stage light, a scar preserved deliberately as a reminder. Beauty can emerge from brokenness. Eastwood Academy changed because it had to. No longer could gatekeepers pretend excellence wore only one face. They accepted dozens more students from overlooked neighborhoods, because donors now demanded to see more Devon Carters. Professor Whitmore became director of those programs. And Devon Carter? He became not just a world-class violinist, but a symbol. His lectures would echo one message: don't judge by privilege. Don't dismiss the boy with the taped violin. Because music, like dignity, belongs to everyone. And whenever he returned home to Detroit, now walking confidently past broken radiators and peeling walls unchanged since his childhood, he carried his father's violin and remembered the words Claudia had whispered while pouring cheap coffee and mopping floors before dawn. Fire, hunger, and music that comes from somewhere real. He played, and the sound filled not just his home, not just orchestra halls, but hearts around the world. If a story touched you, remember this. Never underestimate the one holding an old instrument, wearing borrowed shoes, or coming from forgotten zip code. Sometimes they are carrying notes that move marble halls to tears and tear down prejudice with a bow stroke. Sometimes greatness is already here, waiting to be heard.